Thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us. So today we're delighted to launch the CCP Volume EM Show and Tell series. This is the first session of our new program, so thank you for being here and thank you for supporting this new effort that we're undertaking. So the broad aim of this new series, just to give you a little bit of introduction, is to share useful computational tools, approaches, and practical ideas for the Volume EM community in a friendly and accessible format. So we're particularly keen for these sessions to be useful for people at different stages, including those who are completely new to a topic. We will be asking for suggestions for topics and speakers to make sure that these sessions are aligned as much as possible with the community needs and interests. And we'll be sharing further information as part of this session today about how you can make those suggestions for speakers or topics that you might be interested in us including in this programme. So with that, for our first session today, we will be hearing from Dr. Martin Jones from the Francis Crick Institute, who will be giving us a brief introduction to the use of containers for reproducible image analysis. He'll also give us a little bit more context about the efforts of CCP Volume EM, with this being the first talk in our series. So for those of you who don't know Martin, Martin leads the microscopy prototyping sub-team within the Crick's electron microscopy science technology platform. He helps develop hardware and software for Volume EM and Volume CLEM data. He also works closely with the Crick's software engineering and AI teams to help ensure tools are developed sustainably and made accessible to end users. So in today's talk, Martin will be giving us a beginner-friendly introduction to containers, including Docker, Singularity, and Apptainer. We will leave some time for questions at the end, so please add your questions to the Q&A tab. You can add them as we go, and we will try and get through as many of those as possible at the end of today's session. And just to give you a quick note before we begin, we will be recording this session and we will be sharing it on the CCP Volume EM YouTube channel, which already has some videos. So feel free to take a look at that if you're particularly interested in the work that we're doing. And with that, I will hand over to Martin, and thank you again for joining us for this session.
Thank you. Right, let me try and share my screen. Does that look like it's shared okay?
Yes, that looks great, Martin.
Perfect. Okay, right. This is the first time I've given this talk, so we'll see how I do for time. The aim of this really is just to we talk about containers in various contexts, and it's definitely something that's quite outside the scope of most biological research, and so this is aiming to familiarize people a bit with some of the terminology, what it might be useful for, how to get started, how to find useful tools, and maybe where I think these things might go in the future. But before we start, this is the first one of these show and tells organised by this thing called CCP Volume EM. I guess not everybody knows what that is. It's a new community effort funded by one of the UK funding councils, STFC, as part of COSEC, which stands for Computational Science Centre for Research Communities, apparently. Collaborative computational projects are community-driven initiatives that build and support computational tools and expertise for specific research domains in UK scientific community, but obviously it can also benefit internationally. And they generally work on things like developing, maintaining and supporting software, providing training workshops and support for users and developers, and trying to build collaborations between academics, research institutions and the national computing services. For anyone who's not familiar with Volume EM, I'll also give a very quick introduction to why we need these advanced computational methods. So this is a particular type of Volume EM called serial block face scanning EM. We scan over the surface of the sample like a normal electron microscope, scanning electron microscope, but then we can cut away the surface and image again and slice and image and slice and image thousands and thousands of times. And this is one of many types of volume EM imaging methods. So there's all kinds based on transmission and scanning EM methods using block face imaging or using imaging in array tomography. But they all have similar challenges in terms of the type of data that we need to deal with. Here's two example data sets. So on the left is serial block face scanning EM data scrolling 50 nanometers per slice through a pellet of about, I think, 10 HeLa cells. Each grey blob is a single cell. And on the right is a single cell imaged in focused ion beam scanning EM with 5 nanometer isotropic voxels. And in this case, one cell could be a terabyte in disk storage. So significant amounts of data that are very hard to analyze. And in recent years, volume EM has become a very hot topic. So back in a couple of years ago, a few years ago now, it was one of Nature's 7 technologies to watch alongside the James Webb Space Telescope. Okay, so the CCP volume EM. So at the moment, we're operating as a funded 2-year project which runs until the end of this year to develop this computational community with a view to this then becoming a permanent collaborative computational project. Some of the other CCPs have been going for over 40 years. So the goal is that this will be a long-term benefit for the community. And it integrates with CCPs across all different scientific and now humanities domains. And there's experts in all sorts of AI and high performance compute and new technologies. So being plugged into that broader context is very useful for us doing volume EM. Obviously, there are a lot of existing communities, so we're not suggesting we replace any communities. We want to exist alongside lots of past and present communities. So new bias was a big stimulus for a lot of the image analysis activities going on in Europe at the moment. Royal Microscopical Society, the Volume EM initiative has been a very strong influence in this, and all of the other imaging societies and networks. So the current situation in volume EM is we've got these huge, rich data sets, terabytes and terabytes, some of which are out in public repositories. And they're analysed for whatever scientific question they are required for. But actually, it leaves a lot of data on the table. There's a lot of interesting things that other people might be able to learn from that data, maybe a different scientific question, or maybe they can develop a new analysis method or train their AI model on interesting data. And a lot of things we do, there are kind of solutions out there, good solutions, but knowing what software to use and what methods to use is challenging. And we often hit this problem of, oh, I've seen this software, I'd love to use it, but I just can't get it to install. I don't really know how to use it when it does install. I don't quite know if it is the right tool. I know this was written by a PhD student who's moving to industry next year, so will this still work next year? That kind of thing. And it's led to quite a confusing ecosystem, and there's no clear consensus on how to do a lot of the necessary processing for volume EM. So the CCP volume EM aims to try and alleviate a lot of the bottlenecks that we experience by focusing on 3 primary areas. So community building and consolidation, research software and data management, so some example projects of real technical work, and also training and skills. And as we've been going, we've discovered that this thing called containerization looks like it's an enabling technology for these last 2 items on this list. Okay, so first of all, some expectation management. So I'm not proposing containers are a magic solution to all of your problems. In a lot of cases, the most streamlined thing to do is to really build things, install natively on your system. For some softwares, that's very easy, like Fiji. For other softwares, that can be a bit harder. And if you're already comfortable installing and using these things, then there's no need for you to switch to containers to run your analysis. However, this containerization process can relieve certain roadblocks, so certain technical challenges, but also it really provides a gold standard in reproducibility and scalability. Okay, so scientific reproducibility. So we want to have our code open source. Is that enough? Just putting your code online somewhere doesn't necessarily mean you're doing open science. If people can't make your software work or even install it, then they're not likely to use it. It probably doesn't contribute a great deal to the scientific community, and it often ends up with a lot of people kind of reinventing the wheel, like recoding something that somebody's already done a lot of work on before, or just giving up and doing something different. So the analogy of sort of providing this recipe and instructions. So for example, if we want to bake a cake, we get a list of ingredients and then the method, the steps that we perform in certain orders. And if we follow that recipe, then we should get reproducible results. So we should get good quality chocolate cake if we follow those instructions. And in software, this is equivalent to sharing information about the computational tools and libraries that you used to run your code, and also obviously the code that you use to solve the task. So that should be enough, right? Um, for a long time, image analysis reporting in journal publications was along the lines of my image analysis was done in Fiji. That's obviously not useful. What we want to see more of is this uh, approach, like here, for example, the CellPose project, which is a very nice deep learning project for mostly for light microscopy. We release the code, the instructions, how to run the code, how to build your environment so the code runs properly. We version control it so when it changes, we know what's been changed and when. And we provide that in something like a GitHub repository so that other people can come along and install the software and run the software. So, and very often this is done via something like Python environment. So something like Conda or virtual environment, which allows you a developer to specify, I use this Python version, this version of scikit-image or other computational libraries. This is how I combined them and ran my code on them. And this generally is fine. It works well in short term and if you're working on similar computers, but you find maybe as time goes on or as you move to a slightly different platform, then maybe that set of instructions doesn't quite work anymore, especially in complex builds. So we get this sort of phenomenon of, well, it worked on my machine, so it's your problem. And we want to try and avoid that. So um, the one of the things that leads to this sort of problem is something that some people call software rot or bit rot, which is that code that works now. If I don't change it, I assume it should work in the future. But because the ecosystem around it is kind of changing and maybe there's some breaking changes, so some new library changes the way it does certain things, that previously working software, if you're not very, very precise how you define its operating parameters, will suddenly stop working and it can be very hard to work out why. So this idea of encasing your code in a container can help preserve it for future use. So here's a mosquito encased in amber from some millions of years ago, with the idea that if you, as well as just freezing the code, you freeze the surroundings around your code as well in some smart way, you can make sure that it will always work no matter how much the technology around it has changed. And in the future, new computers might be incompatible. They might bring out a different chip architecture or a different way of doing certain things. And so the standard ways of running code like that might be different. So with containers, you package all of this compatibility interface, and then in principle, as long as it's still possible to run containers, then that code will still run, albeit on an archaic version of some ecosystem. Um, these containers are generally mostly operating system agnostic. So if you change from being a Windows developer to a Mac developer, then maybe it doesn't affect you so much. And one of the big steps in making sure that these things remain usable in the future is something called the Open Container Initiative, which sort of broke the framework for how containers are defined out of any individual commercial hands. So this was in 2015. The Open Container Initiative, I think originated by Docker, in fact, was established to try and stop people inventing their own file formats. So, like in bioimaging, we have this problem of proliferation of formats, and without bioformats, we wouldn't be able to open half the images that we acquire on anything other than the vendor's software. The Open Container Initiative stopped that right at the step one. So we fortunately didn't hit this problem of proliferation of formats. And this specifies how containers are built and stored and run and shared so that any major container system that you might use, like Docker or Podman or Singularity or Apptainer or lots of other things, they all adhere to the same design principles. So even if one of those organizations disappears in the future, all of their outputs, all of the things you built to work on their systems will work on other systems. Okay, so I'm going to now go through some of the concepts, and I'll explain mostly in terms of Docker, but generally other tools, because of this OCI, will work in similar ways. An important factor is the difference between different computational infrastructure. So most people, I guess, work with laptops or on workstations for their image analysis. But with volume EM and a lot of microscopy nowadays, you really need to be scaling up into more powerful compute systems like high performance compute or cloud systems. And it can be really hard to make code go from working on your laptop to working on HPC or in the cloud. So what containers can do, as well as aiding this kind of long-term reproducibility of your code, it can also help you deploy software tools on different computational infrastructure. So, for example, you build a container on your laptop. In principle, you can run that without changing it on other infrastructure like a high-performance computer or in the cloud. Another important concept is virtual machines. So people may be more familiar with this than with containers. But virtual machines are this idea that here I've got a Mac operating system, and I might open a virtual machine or install a virtual machine where I install a whole Windows operating system or a whole Linux operating system within my Mac operating system. And that's good. That helps solve some of the problems we're trying to solve. But in practice, what happens is these are very heavy objects. So each virtual machine, so each one of these pillars might be a different virtual machine, needs all of its own operating system, all of its own libraries, all of its own application code, and it needs to be coordinated somehow by your host operating system. If you happen to have virtual machines that use identical code somewhere within them, they can't share it. You just need to install it multiple times. So you can end up with redundancy or duplication of code and using up unnecessary storage. The way containers work is things are much closer to the host operating system. So they have a very thin interface where they can run dedicated binaries or libraries and applications uh, in a bundled way, but that are in a way that are able to share those binaries and libraries with each other because they're not completely ring fenced like the virtual machines. And because they're much smaller, they don't have their own big whole operating systems. They start much faster, they're much smaller on disk, and they're easier to transport around. Okay, so the general overview of the container world is you start by having some sort of build specification. So this is similar to those Conda environments. So I specify that I want to use this version of Python and this version of numerical Python libraries and so on. In Docker, this is called a Docker file. This is just a simple text file, so just a few kilobytes of information. Then that is built into a container. So this container, sorry, into a container image, which is an immutable software artifact. So it's a thing that doesn't change. It's like a CD, right? It's read only. You can't edit the contents without having to create a whole new one. And then from that container image, you can launch an instance of a container, and that is the thing that can do the computation. So this is now running this set of libraries and application software on your host system. Okay, so the Docker file, so they tend to look like this. Don't worry if that looks a bit frightening. Generally, this will be handled by the developers of the software, but really it's just a text file that defines uh, what are the necessary parts to build this system. It's often built on a pre-existing container, so you don't need to know everything about everything all the way to the very low level. And every line in here defines something called a new layer. So layers are an important concept. So yeah, don't worry about the details. Ideally, end users will be given pre-built images and won't have to deal with these Docker files. But just to show you kind of what's going on here, I'll run through it. So this first line takes the very low-level, basic kind of thin Linux-like tooling to build a Python implementation with some additional information about the exact version. I'll explain that a bit more later. And then given that installation, I define a bunch of things based on that. So maybe this is just a thing that stops the operating or it stops the installation asking you yes, no questions. It just runs through assuming you say yes to everything. This line just installs a bunch of system software. You don't need to worry what this is. It just makes sure that this container has the right tools to be able to build or run the software that you want. You can define things like where the workspace is going to be. You can add files in from your local file system. So this copies a text file that contains some build requirements into the container. And then this line takes that file and builds some Python tooling based on that. And then this line will just copy the contents of the directory on my host system into the directory in my container. And finally, the last line just is what happens when you launch a container with this. This is the thing that happens. So this runs the command Python and runs the script main.py. So like I say, don't worry about the details there. That's just an example of what one of these files looks like. They can get very complicated for complex builds. They generally follow this sort of structure, but again, this is more developer side information. So I said each command creates a new layer, building on the previous layers. So I can view this image container image as a stack of different layers. So the first layer is associated with this command, next one with this command, and so on. If I change something, then I need to reinstall or reprocess that layer. But um, what what I can do is if I change something here, I realize I missed out an important package to install. All of these things that I've already built into the image, I don't need to do again. This is already cached and saved, and I don't need to rebuild it. I only need to rebuild the last parts after anything that I've changed. And a lot of the tricks in containerization is doing this efficiently, so you don't have to keep rebuilding lots of things. And then this whole thing now, this is the container image. So this is the object that you can share with people to run your software. Um, so you might ask, how does Docker know if I changed one of these layers or not? And it uses something called a image digest, which is these really horrible looking complicated strings of numbers and letters. All you need to know is that that is unique to that layer. If it changes at all, then it will give a very different image digest. So Docker will be able to tell that that is changed. And when you're installing these things, you'll see a lot of these things that look like this scrolling through your window. Don't worry about it. It's just Docker doing its bookkeeping and checking for things that have been previously installed. Okay, so these images, an important feature of them is that they are immutable. That is, they can't be changed without you creating a new, different image. And containers are or container images are often built up from several layers, and each of those layers is also immutable. And what this means is I can have individual layers that I've used in different builds that I can use in other builds. So I have an efficiency of, if I always install this particular Python library into this particular base installation, then I only need that once on my disk. I don't need to do that for every single container image that might want to use that software stack. Okay, so the container images are the shareable artifacts, but they don't perform computation. It's just like giving somebody a disk, like a CD-ROM. The An image from a particular build, you would normally apply a name and a tag to it, so you know which one it was. So I ran this analysis on my application version 1.0, so that if I have changed things in the future, I can always come back and know which exact version of the software I used for my analysis. Um, so a container image with its associated name and tag can then be run to create an instance of the image as a container. And what that does is it loads the image, adds another layer, which is now the bit that is kind of editable. So this now is where the computation happens. This is called the container layer. And now this whole package is called the container. And now this can be used for doing computation. So this is the bundle that you run when you execute these containers. So I mentioned version tags. I think these are very important in terms of reproducibility. If you don't specify the tag, then it's potluck whether whether the next person uses exactly the same software that you used. If you specify the tag, then hopefully the next person will be able to run exactly the same analysis. If you don't provide a tag when you download a container image, it will default to the latest, which in some software updates every few days, and that is very likely to be different to the last time you ran it. So when you run an analysis, it's much better to use a specific tag that you know worked. Or if you're writing a publication and you want the reviewers to know exactly which version of your software was used, then you can make the tag, for example, specific to that publication. So it's very easy to find the correct analysis workflow. Um, these tags are kind of user defined. If you accompany that with the image digest, so this kind of long string of um, letters and digits, then that completely uniquely defines the software. So anybody in the future can run exactly the analysis that you wanted them to run. Okay, so while the container images are immutable, containers are ephemeral, and that means that they're short-lived and disposable. So when I run run the container, it it loads into memory and it starts doing its processing. But then if I destroy that container, anything that I'd done within the container, within this container layer, disappears. So it's ephemeral. It's volatile and it's lost when you destroy the container. If you did something that you then wanted to save as a new layer, you can commit that new layer to become a new layer within a new image, which can be a useful way for building these containers in development. But of course, we want to be able to process data and then have the data still on our disk when we have finished close the container down. And the way we do that is with something called volumes. So we already saw in the Docker file, there's a copy command. So I can copy files directly into the image if I know what they are ahead of time. But with image data, I may not know exactly what images I want to run it on, or I may use a container after I've acquired new images. And so in that case, we use something called volumes. And this acts more like a network file system. And it allows us to be more flexible in the way we interact with files. So we can read files from the host file system, and we can write files to the host file system. But importantly, only in places that we allow it to. So we have to specify it where it's allowed to do this, so we can make sure we don't accidentally overwrite or delete things that we shouldn't do. We can mount volumes as read only, so we don't write incorrectly to important data. And if I've got multiple containers doing different steps of a workflow, I can have them all connecting to the same volume and passing information by data files. Okay, so how this all fits together. So if I've got my Docker file, that specifies the build, and that might go to something called a container registry, where it pulls that Python image from or some other base image. And then maybe I send in some local files like the requirements file or some test data. They all go into this image, which is the fixed bundled immutable object. Then that image can be run. And now that does our processing. We can attach external data and code and other items on file in a flexible way via these volume commands. And one of the really powerful things of this sort of method is for one image, if I want to do the same thing on lots and lots of data, and I've got access to lots and lots of computers or nodes on HPC, I can take that single image and I can run it multiple times across different systems, accessing the same data directories and so on. So you can really see how this scales on HPC or cloud computing. Okay, so these containers are sort of little boxes where you send something and it processes, and then it maybe writes a file somewhere. In image analysis, often we want to use a graphical user interface, and this is tricky. I think this is one of the things that's been a major block in people using containers for image analysis, and that is that the technical challenge of kind of piping information out of this closed container requires certain amount of security and a certain amount of technical know-how to set up. If you're using Linux, this is very straightforward because the containers are typically built in a Linux-like package. If you're not using Linux, which is probably most people here, I guess, then you need to connect via something called a port. So if I have a container, I can define a port in that container. So some ports you can just choose random numbers, some have sort of convention numbers that you might use. And I can, in the Docker file, I can expose that port to the outside. And then if on my computer, I attach a port on my computer to that port, which I can now see within the container, then I can pipe that through to some local application to view my data interactively, or to view my processes interactively. So there's lots of ways you can deal with this. VNC, SSH tunneling, XPRA is a relatively new one, or at least to me, relatively new. And these vary greatly in difficulty of configuration. And like I say, I think that difficulty has been one of the big blocks to being able to use these things effectively. I think recently XPRA has been emerging as maybe the preferred way to do this. So I'll give a little demo in a moment about what that looks like and how it how it can expose these graphical user interfaces. But next, I'm gonna talk about how to use Docker without having to get your hands dirty with command line, or at least too much. So Docker has this nice bundle called Docker Desktop, and you can install this. It's free for personal use, and it actually seems to be a pretty decent um, uh, range of functionalities for personal use. There are other alternatives that you can use as well, but I think this is by far the most common. And you can install for basically any common operating system. And that presents an application like this, where you have a tab where you can look at the different images that you have on your system, the different containers you might have running. You can browse containers available on something called a Docker Hub and lots of other things which I won't have time to talk about today. If you're installing Docker Desktop, like I say, most of these containers are somehow built on a Linux type base, but you don't need to know anything about Linux to use them generally. So if you're on Linux, then that makes interacting with these things very straightforward. If you start Docker Desktop on Mac or Windows, it launches something called the Docker engine. And definitely on Mac, and I think on most Windows, that actually launches a really tiny virtual machine. I know I said we're trying to replace virtual machines, but in this case, this thin virtual machine just allows you to run these Linux containers from one single virtual machine, and Docker Desktop handles that entirely for you. So you don't need to worry about setting up the virtual machine. Okay, I'm going to do a quick demo of a possible workflow that might be of interest to some people. So I know that Nipari is often a challenging software to install, and containerization looks like a useful way of doing this. So I can go to the Nipari GitHub page, I can search for their containerization, and it tells me we have containers available at this place. And this part after the colon is the tag. That's, I think, the latest build. We can also put a tag there, which is the version of Nipari. So, for example, the latest stable version is 0.6.6. if if you're looking at containers that are available directly in Docker Hub, then you can download those um, directly via Docker Hub into uh, Docker Desktop. But if you need to get one from elsewhere, then you can simply copy and paste the command. So here I have opened Docker Desktop. It's a recording, not a live demo, because I'm not um, crazy. What I do is I open a small terminal window here, which is built into the Docker Desktop. I copy and paste the command, edited with the version that I want, and I run that. Because I've already downloaded this, it's already cached in my space. But if you don't already have it locally, then it will download it. Now I can go through, when I run the container, I can name it. I can define this port, so how my local system can get into the container. I can define some data directory that I want it to be able to read and what I want to call that within the container. And then if I run this container, it produces a whole load of incomprehensible stuff. But eventually what happens is it enables some links up the top here. And what XPRA does, the port that we connect to allows you to open it in the web browser. And so if I click on this link, then this opens a web browser, does some other stuff in the background. And now within the browser, I've got the working Napari. I can browse to the volume that I attached. I can look at the data that I've put in that volume, and I can work with it. On a high performance computer system, you can actually do very similar things. Most high performance compute uses Linux or something similar. But you generally can't use Docker because it's restricted because of the permissions that it requires. So there are HPC-friendly alternatives like Apptainer, which was previously known as Singularity, although confusingly, there is also a Singularity now, which has branched off as a commercial branch. And I can now, in my high-performance computer, either in a terminal or via some sort of batch script, I can run the command very similar to the Docker command. I can specify maybe that I want to use an NVIDIA GPU because I might want to do some deep learning stuff. This tells me or tells Apptainer that this is a Docker container, so I need to convert it. This tells it where to look for that container image and again specify the version that you want to install. If I run that, it runs through, it converts into the Apptainer preferred format. And again, it will produce a link that I can then open in my browser on my laptop. So I can access my high performance compute via my browser with Napari. And I think that is super powerful. And I think something we should build more and more into. So as you build these containers, they're very easy to share, or these container images, they're very easy to share. And so I think there's a good opportunity for either labs or core facilities to share amongst themselves container images that work and keep a curated list of tools and functionality that everyone can agree to use without having to install everything from scratch. The image registries like Docker Hub, Key.io, and GitHub Container Registry have quite good free storage for public containers. So you can also just upload them to your account on those sites, and they'll be available to anyone with internet access. If you associate a container with a publication, you don't get a DOI from these registries, but you can archive a container image into something like Zenodo, which will then give you a DOI. So when you're publishing, you can attach that sort of citable link to this container specifically. So how to get containers that are already out there. So I already mentioned Docker Hub. So you can search for lots of things. There's not so many image analysis containers up there at the moment. Hopefully we can change that. You can search for ones that people have already built, and often these are good to go. You just download them and they'll run no problem at all. Key.io is another one that's quite widely used in research. So, for example, the Rosalind Franklin Institute put a lot of their containers up there. This is an example if you want to download some Jupyter, some container images to perform analysis in Jupyter notebooks. You can go to the Jupyter organization and download directly from there. We've been using containers for training as part of the volumeEM community and CCP-volumeEM. So Gabriel and Piper at the Rosalind Franklin Institute have built and maintained a bunch of containers that we use specifically for volumeEM courses that are publicly available. They were built specifically to run courses like this ClemReg course we ran a few months ago. But in principle, they should work on other systems. If you try it and they don't work, let us know. Okay, a question that comes up sometimes is, doesn't this kind of virtualization make things slower? And technically, yes, these things will run a little bit slower, but maybe a few percent in most cases, but often it's not really negligible. And the benefits you get from being able to use these systems outweigh that small loss. The exception there is on recent Macs that have these M1, M2, etc. chips. Some container images are not built with that architecture in mind, and if that's the case, Docker Desktop will run it via something called emulation, which sort of is another layer of virtualization which can impact the performance. But a lot of common base images have multiple architectures available in their registries. And if you're doing anything kind of large scale on HPC, then they're most likely the native Linux ones, and they'll be extremely efficient. So if you want to find out more about how to learn about these things, so Piper at the RFI has been building some really nice documentation on the website associated with the training courses and the containers over there. So I think still in progress, but there's lots of useful information there. Again, any feedback, very welcome. There's a lot of online training. I would say a lot of training is designed for kind of industry and people who are making cloud web servers and so on. So a lot of YouTube tutorials are not necessarily directly applicable, but there's a lot of useful information out there if you don't mind sifting through. So Docker has its own tutorials. There's a web-based playground where if you don't want to install locally, you can play around in a browser. This one, container.training, has lots of courses. There's one that has 908 slides, which is pretty epic. But it's very bite-sized pieces, and probably only the first 100 small slides are sort of important to understand what's going on. But again, that's tailored more towards commercial software developers. The Carpentries, if you're familiar with that, it's this sort of community organized training for computation. They have some training courses that they're building, and there's one on Docker and I think one on Singularity there as well. Okay, last couple of slides. So I wish I could say that, everything's already out there and you just need to go plug in and it will solve all your problems. I think it's a work in progress. There's a few teams who are using containers to great effect, especially when you have to coordinate very large, complex workflows. A lot of the training that's out there, like I say, is not really so accessible for our end users. And then I suppose I'd sort of query whether people aren't using containers because it's a bad idea or just because there's not enough training for people to learn how to use it. Where I think this sort of stuff might go in the future, once we kind of hit critical mass and there's an ecosystem of tools out there, then and the community make use of those tools, then sharing reproducible research should be very straightforward. You should be able to just say, I use this version with this image digest, and that is exactly the analysis I did. No possibility of it producing some kind of erroneous answers. Um, because these containers, they're great to work locally, but because they work on HPC and cloud as well, I think that's a really powerful way of extending work you might be doing locally into larger computational infrastructure. And with things like image repositories like Empire Bioimage Archive, there's this concept of bringing the compute to the data. So when your data is so big that it takes you days or weeks to download it, then it's more efficient to spin up some sort of computational infrastructure near the data, in this case, in the cloud somewhere, most likely. And these container methods exactly the way that you would do that. Also, there's an accessibility element. So not everyone's lucky enough to have dedicated high performance compute resources, and the ability to access a community tested and curated set of workflows could be very empowering for labs who maybe are able to pay for some hours here and there of cloud compute to analyze data, maybe their own data or data that's in one of the repositories. If you want to get help about this, the advice is always start with image.sc. This is the go-to place for anything image analysis related. There's not a great deal about Docker on there at the moment. So to alleviate that, after this talk, when the video's recording's ready, I'll add a thread there so we can, anyone who's interested can discuss and ask questions on there. And actually, I found ChatGPT is surprisingly good at getting you started with creating and debugging Docker files, because this open container initiative has really standardized things. Then almost all of the Docker files that ChatGPT was trained on are good Docker files, and it's there's very little kind of garbage that's been skewing the training. So I'll stop there. So we recently launched our website, so please go and take a look at that. There's a mailing list you can sign up for, and then I'll just thank everyone involved in CCP-volumeEM. So people on the grey block were originally involved in the grant, and then everyone else we've accumulated as we have been working on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That was a really excellent talk, and I'm feeling quite excited about containers now. Um, so we do have 5 minutes or so left for questions. So I don't know if anyone in the audience has any questions. I believe you should be able to raise your hand if you do, and then I can unmute you so that you're able to ask Martin a question. But while you're all thinking about that, I had a couple of my own questions for Martin. So, the first one being, what would be the first practical thing you'd recommend trying after this talk for someone completely new to containers?
Yeah, I think because there's already a lot of things out there that you can try, you don't feel like you need to start writing Docker files and so on. I think downloading Docker Desktop or going to that online platform to play around and just search for your something that might be useful for you. So maybe you want to use Jupyter notebooks, or maybe you want to find a container that runs Fiji or Napari or something, and just have a go and see. I think the perception of how hard it is maybe is um, a bit worse than it actually is, especially now. I think that graphical user interface thing was the being able to use XPRA, for example, I think is a real big step because it was pretty ugly before to try and get these things
Yeah.
to work.
Yeah, and I guess related to that point, I thought one of the points that you made in the talk about the low uptake, I think it would be really interesting to explore that with some input from the community, whether that's a training issue and or what. So perhaps that's something that we could explore at a future point. I can't see any hands raised just yet. Um, so I'll move on to another of my questions. So I wondered what you thought about in your experience. What kind of image analysis workflows would benefit most from containerizations and which ones might not need it?
Yeah, I think definitely something like Fiji, which is very easy to install and kind of installs it anywhere for images that you can fit on your local computer. There's probably no point running that in a container to do your analysis. Sharing the container with your publication is a good step for reproducibility, but that's more of a kind of a persistent artifact than the thing that you use to do your analysis. If
Mhm.
you want to do, I think a lot of the deep learning frameworks uh, can be very hard to configure the Python tools and the versions of the libraries and so on. So having essentially the the people who make these libraries supply a container that has exactly the right thing set up for you, and then maybe you add some new layers to include your specific um, libraries and functionality. I think that's one of the real benefits. And actually, there's a really nice project which I didn't mention, which is called DL for Mic Everywhere, which is an extension of the deep learning for microscopy, sorry, zero cost DL for Mic project from a while ago, which was based on Google Colab. Now they've converted a lot of things into containers, and really that means they can pull in all of these community containers that exist in the bioimage model zoo in a way that maybe doesn't require so much kind of manipulation and work to get it to work with a broader framework.
Fab. Probably just one or two more questions before we wrap up. Would you say that there are any major limitations or pitfalls of containers that beginners should be aware of?
Um, yeah, I guess don't overcomplicate things. Like if you're doing something simple, then this is a nice skill to learn, but don't feel you have to do it. Um, uh, I think probably when you start getting into building your own Docker files and maybe you start trying to work out how to get different pieces of software working with each other that maybe clash, then it can be you can kind of get back to some similar problems of configuration. But once you've got it, then you find a system that works, you nail it down, and you don't change it, and you know it's not going to change the next time that library updates. And the graphical user interface stuff, I think is XPRA is great, still a little clunky compared to using a native version of Napari. So if you're able to install Napari locally, then you'll probably find it runs a bit nicer, a bit smoother. But once you start talking about running it on HPC, then I think it immediately becomes very, very useful to do it that way.
Fab. Um, Great. Well, I think let's wrap it up there. I haven't seen any questions come in from our audience, but thank you, Martin, for giving us that introduction to containers and for kicking off our new show and tell series. And thank you for everyone who's attended today for spending your lunch times with us. We will upload the video to YouTube once it's available, and I will look at getting some of perhaps those links to the training resources and things that you shared in your slides added to our website. So keep an eye on the website for that. I'll also share the details of our next talk that's coming up next month. So Kimberly Meacham will be sharing good software practices with us, but I'll circulate details of how to register for that via the usual channels. So yeah, thank you again for everyone for attending, and see you next month. Bye bye.